So in my previous video, I went over a nightmare dungeon glitch currently in Diablo 4 that essentially allows you to farm nightmare dungeons with a specific nightmare dungeon affix as many times as you want through the Warplane system. Now in this video, I want to go over one of the very good uses for this. There's a few things we have to go over as to why this specific nightmare dungeon affix is such a good use for this glitch. Now, I would recommend checking out that previous video, but a quick TLDR is when you're going through and choosing your Warplanes playlist, choose as many nightmare dungeons as you can, because when you get to a nightmare dungeon through your playlist, it'll give you the free sigil, so you can just teleport to dungeon and it'll have an opened nightmare dungeon for you. Now, whatever affix that dungeon has on it, whether it be Heradric Strongroom or Forgotten Wisdom or Gold Reserve, whatever affix that has on that dungeon will not change if you do not complete that dungeon. So essentially what you can do is you can go through, you can complete all of the dungeon, just don't defeat the boss at the end and fully complete it, and you can teleport back to town, reset dungeons, and teleport back to that same dungeon. Or more specifically, you could teleport to whatever the new dungeon is, because while it'll keep the exact same affix after you reset the dungeon, it will kind of randomize what nightmare dungeon it gives you, but again, it keeps that same affix. So let's say you get to your nightmare dungeon run for that Warplanes playlist, and then you don't use your own key, you just teleport to the nightmare dungeon that they have open for you, and it has a Forgotten Wisdom affix on it. Well, you can then go clear that whole dungeon, just don't defeat the boss at the end, teleport back to town, go to your map and reset dungeons, which is at the bottom of your quest log, and then teleport back using the Warplane system. It'll take you to a randomized dungeon, but that dungeon will always have the same affix. And you can get super lucky and get things like treasure breaches where you could infinitely farm a treasure breach nightmare dungeon, but there's actually a really good use for this from one of the specific affixes. And before we go over that specific affix, you do have to know a little bit about nightmare dungeon sigils, because a normal nightmare dungeon sigil is actually much weaker for most affixes than running an escalation nightmare dungeon. Now, most of you probably know what escalation nightmare dungeons are, but if you don't, it's essentially the legendary nightmare dungeon keys where you go in, you'll complete a nightmare dungeon, then it'll give you a portal to go to a second one, and then when you defeat that, it takes you to a third one. So you're essentially completing 3 nightmare dungeons in a row. Then after that third one, it'll take you to Astaroth, who is essentially a layer boss, and you defeat him and he will give you a bunch of loot as well. And when you're going from dungeon to dungeon, each subsequent dungeon will have more affixes on it and they will be randomized. Now, just at a baseline, escalation nightmare dungeon sigils give more loot through most of their affixes. And a good comparison would be the Gold Reserve affix, which just spawns in a bunch of chests in those dungeons that give you a bunch of gold when you open them. Well, if you do a normal nightmare dungeon sigil and open one of those chests, it'll give you usually around 5 to 6 million gold. But if you do a Gold Reserve as an escalation nightmare sigil and open one of those chests, it'll usually give you closer to like 10 to 11 million. So that's double for that. Some affixes aren't as bad as that, but most of the affixes that are new chests that you open up for more loot are significantly better in escalation sigils than normal nightmare dungeon sigils. Now, the big problem with this when it comes to doing this glitch is that the free keys that your Warplanes give you are always just normal nightmare dungeon sigils, and most of the best affixes from nightmare dungeons, besides something like a treasure breach, are through those chests. So things like Obol Reserves, Gold Reserve, the Material Reserve, even things like Vile Splendor, where all of the elites will drop a ton of gold, even stuff like that is scaled much higher for escalation sigils than normal sigils. But there is one affix that seems pretty close when you're comparing a normal sigil to an escalation sigil, and that is Heradric Strongrooms. And this is the affix you're going to be fishing for through the Warplanes system to get it as a Warplane dungeon to be able to infinitely reset it and farm infinite Heradric Strongrooms. And the main things you're going to be getting from this and why it's so strong is because once you go in the Heradric Strongroom and defeat the boss at the end and loot the chest, both the boss and the chest will have a good chance to give you escalation sigils. The chest has a very high chance, but the chest will also drop a ton of talisman items every single time. In fact, it's usually 6+ charms or seals every time you open it. They can actually give you more the better you do in that Heradric Strongroom. So I've gotten upwards of like 8 charms doing a single Heradric Strongroom. And because of how Heradric strong rooms work, you could do them very quickly in these nightmare dungeons because usually they are somewhat close to the entrance of that dungeon. So that means once you get Heradric strong room through the warplane system, you would teleport into that dungeon, you would look around the start of the dungeon, which it has the little pointer pointing towards it. You would go open up the portal to the Heradric strong room, you would go in, complete that strong room, get all of the loot, make sure to loot the chest, take the portal back out into the dungeon, and then just teleport back to town and reset the dungeon. You don't have to do any additional things within those dungeons. So not only are you able to do these and complete these significantly faster than any other affix of nightmare dungeons, but the amount of loot is pretty ridiculous. And what's really nice about this specific farm is you also don't need a lot of skill points for your endgame skill trees to make this farm significantly better. You only really need 2, and that's in the middle of the Nightmare Dungeon tree. You have a Dread Revival, which bosses in Nightmare Dungeons have a chance to revive when slain, and then you have a Reoccurring Nightmare. Bosses in Nightmare Dungeons gain +1 monster power and have a chance to drop Escalation sigils. Now the reason you want both of these is because that boss that you defeat at the end of a Heradric strong room can drop you Escalation sigils, and they can respawn through the first node we went over. So you can technically get 2 Escalation sigils from that boss, even though it's kind of rare. But then also opening the chest at the end has a very, very high chance to give you an Escalation sigil. So at the max high end, if you got super lucky, you could get 3 Escalation sigils from 1 Heradric strong room. That's probably not going to happen because defeating that boss seems to have a somewhat low chance to give you an Escalation sigil. But again, looting the chest gives you a very high chance to get one. So just defeating the boss with these nodes gives you more chances for more of these sigils. Now, on top of this, opening that chest at the end gives you a ton of additional stuff. It gives you a bunch of like random materials and stuff. It'll give you a bunch of gem fragments. I think it'll still give you quite a lot of opticite. It'll give you a bunch of other materials. It'll give you some Heradric Q materials. But the main thing you're getting out of the chest that you care about are those charms and seals. Because like I mentioned, I've gotten upwards of like 8 charms out of a single one of these chests. And I'm sure as you've been playing the game, you'll realize the charms and seals, because they're so randomly rolled, are actually one of the biggest power increases you could constantly be building more into, just because of them being randomly rolled, them having the different affixes on them. Most people still don't have the mythic seals they want. Even just getting legendary seals that are well rolled are pretty hard, because you have the top roll that could be something like 10% crit that's crazy, or it could be a much lower roll. Then you have the multiple other rolls on it that could give you pretty massive bonuses depending on what sets you're using. So you do have a lot of charms and seals to actually farm now. You can almost always be farming more to try to get a better rolled set of charms or better rolled seal. And on top of that, vendoring off seals and charms is one of the best ways to make gold. If you vendor a set charm, that's 1.3 million gold. If you vendor a legendary seal, which you'll get a lot of from here, that's millions and millions of gold. If you vendor a unique charm, which you also get a good amount of from this, that's over 8 million gold. So you can get a ridiculous amount of gold from doing this if they're charms or seals you don't want to keep. If you already have enough gold, you could also salvage those charms and seals, which then you can use those resources to re-roll set charms to get greater affix rolls on those affixes, or just roll and get the affixes you actually want on your set charms. I do have a video going over that if you want to learn more specifics about it. But doing this farm and just completing these Heradric strong rooms gives you a ridiculous amount of loot. And that's pretty much all you're going to be doing for this farm. You're just going to be doing Nightmare Dungeons through your Warplanes playlist until you get the Heradric Strong Room affix. Once you have that, all you're going to do is go in the Nightmare Dungeon, find the Heradric Strong Room, complete it, leave that dungeon, teleport back to town, reset your dungeons, and then use the Warplanes teleport to go back into a dungeon. It'll give you another randomized dungeon, but with the same affix on it, so Heradric Strong Room, and you rinse and repeat, infinitely farming these Heradric Strong Rooms, which are pretty juiced when it comes to the specific loot we've gone over in this video. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.